Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to this webinar on the Cyber Resilience Act and the open source community. This is organized by Octet and the Cyberstan projects. I'm very happy that you could join us today. We have a few excellent guests with us who will be explaining what the CRA is, how it might affect you, and some ways in which it'll be possible to learn more about the CRA and then even get some funding and support for your work and to manage the impact of the Cyber Resilience Act. So first of all, I'd like to introduce you to the guests today. Firstly, we have Gael Blondel from the Eclipse Foundation, who, with a 20-year career dedicated to open source, serves as the Chief Membership Officer at the Eclipse Foundation and was appointed to the board of the Open Source Initiative in 2024. And he's played pivotal roles in promoting open source within both research and entrepreneurial communities. And with him as well is Sebastian Hertemat. So Sebastian and Gael, welcome. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for
Thank you,
inviting
James.
us.
And also with us is Matteo Moli from the European Cybersecurity Organization. He is Manager for Cybersecurity Technologies and Innovation at EXO, where he's been focusing on CRA implementation, but also on other areas such as quantum resistance cryptography, software supply chain security, and dual-use technologies. He holds experience in the IT industry, particularly with Cisco, where he focused on software adoption with a varied number of public, private, and partner organizations. So thank you all for joining us. Before we get started, I would just like to run through the agenda. We've got a lot to cover. So first of all, Matteo will be explaining what exactly is the Cyber Resilience Act, and then Gael will be explaining the impact on the open source community. After this, we'll be looking a bit at support that is available in various forms. So how Octet is going to be introducing compliance tools and how Cyberstand is looking to provide support to industry, both for the kind of implementation of the Cyber Resilience Act and for standardization. And then at the end, we'll have an open Q&A and discussion session. So for this purposes, if I could ask, if you have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat, but we'll also be answering them all at the end so we can have a discussion then. We are also recording this meeting, just so you know, and then this will be made publicly available afterwards. So if you do have a discussion or any questions that you'd like to remain private, please feel free to reach out to me and I'll be happy to remove that discussion from the recording afterwards. So with all that said, I think we can jump straight in. So Matteo, I'll pass over to you to explain a bit about the CRA and what its impact will be.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, James. And thank you for introducing me. I hope you can hear me all right. Okay.
Yep.
So, million-dollar question, what is the CRA? I'm not completely aware of the audience today. I assume there are a lot of people from the open source community, also people from our Cyberstand communities, but general public. So I'm not sure to what extent you're familiar with what is the Cyber Resilience Act. And while I was thinking about this session today, hey, thank you, Julian. So I see there are familiar faces out there. I'd like to say, even though there are people that are already familiar with this CRA, I'd like to say maybe something a bit different from the other events and discussion we've been part of. So Cyber Resilience Act is first and foremost a European regulation. I know we sometimes we skip that part, but let me just read the really last sentence of the Article 71 says that this regulation shall be binding in its entirety and directly applicable in all member states. And, you know, I have a background in political science, even though I worked in the IT industry, so many people might not see this distinction. But if you think about NIS2 directive, which is something you're familiar with, or any other directive in the EU, those are essentially like laws that your respective country passes via the legislative process. And directive needs to be then transposed at national levels, meaning that there's some changes might happen, not major changes, but you know the legislation needs to adapt it to the local system. Regulation is what is actually peculiar about the EU, and Cyber Resilience Act is a regulation. The regulation is something that it's immediately binding. It's like as if the parliament in your country had passed a law. So it's very strong as a European move. Now you will see there are some nuances about it. For instance, member states still have a say, and actually they need to perform some tasks to make this regulation work. But still, it is a regulation. like a law that is binding us all. Along the course of the next 3 years, there will be other acts that the European Union will be passing that are intended to help this Cyber Resilience Act work well, so delegated and implementing act. But now, enough for the legal part. What is interesting about the Cyber Resilience Act is that is a regulation, so in essence, is a piece of law of the EU that establishes a minimum level of cybersecurity requirements for product with digital elements. And basically, obviously, all the products that are made available in the EU market. In essence, in order to put the CE mark in your product, so to be part of the EU market and marketize your product in there, you need to be compliant with the Cyber Resilience Act. Until here, this point, so fine, because it's similar for other regulation as well. What is interesting about Cyber Resilience Act is the scope. What I would like to point out a bit. Product with digital elements can comprise really a lot of products. It goes beyond the IoT. If I just read quickly one of the annexes of Cyber Resilience Act, it's pretty interesting in my opinion, and I will explain later what are these lists about. But I can see password managers, network manager system, boot managers, but also operating system, firewalls, intrusion detection system, intrusion prevention system. So you see, there's a lot of software in there. And if someone, have a closer look at the scope of the CRA, they will understand that it's huge. It's impacting a lot of manufacturers. So it's really big. Sometime we like to refer to it as the GDPR for cybersecurity. But also, this implies that Cyber Resilience Act will have a big impact on the supply chain and software supply chains of our industries. Because obviously, especially when it comes to product with digital elements, I'm not the one to tell you, you can teach me about that actually, but your supply chain is very complex, highly complex, and dependencies get spread really far, also outside Europe. But again, Europe is still a very big market. Everyone wants to sell in Europe. If you want to do that, you will need to be compliant with the Cyber Resilience Act. That's why it's so important. As I said, Cyber Resilience Act established a minimum level of cybersecurity requirements. The text called them essential requirements. And now, for those of you that maybe are, I would say, savvy in cybersecurity, you will see in this requirement there's nothing, I would say, completely extraordinary or new. There are provision considering, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the product. But what is interesting is that this is going to be applied horizontally to all the market. It's going to be something that you can't just choose to do or not to do. It's something that you need to apply. And it's, again, interesting also for the community of open source is that there are requirements that are essential for the procedures that companies need to follow. In particular, to give you an example, companies need to have vulnerability handling procedures in place. I'm not sure how many companies out there have at least a documented one out there. There's a need of a software bill of materials. This is very crucial for open source community as well. And this is quite a big novelty that the Cyber Resilience Act is introducing by mandating this. And also some provision about the support along the life cycle. So these are all things probably you're familiar with, but the law is saying this needs to happen to advance the overall security posture of Europe. I hope I haven't been too boring so far, but I will conclude very shortly. I want to just make a note about the timeline. This regulation was proposed in 2022 by the European Commission. It has been entering into force precisely December in 2024, so very recently. And how does it work? I'm not familiar myself with the procedure, but just reading it from the text, there is a difference between entering into force and application. So the law is entering into force, but the actual application of the law, meaning you will be required to apply it, is going to start a bit later. There's like transition period, which it's going to be about 3 years. However, there are some areas of this application that will start earlier. For instance, some provision for the obligation for manufacturers needs to be applied earlier and not in 3 years' time. So, and even if we consider 3 years, this is a relatively short time for companies who need to design product, right? Because you need to think about compliance with this regulation from the design phase. And now, let's say the point that is more crucial for the industry, who created most excitement for the industry, is okay. Everyone says we have this new piece of law. It's going to make us improve our cybersecurity posture. We're going to read through the law and try to apply it. Fine. What happened, because we're Europeans, we have a civil law system. The question is, how do I prove that I'm complying with this law? How do I perform a conformity assessment and how do all these mechanisms work? How can I say, okay, I can prove that I'm complying with the Cyber Resilience Act? And that's where obviously there are a lot of discussions going on, because there's obviously responsibility involved. Who is responsible for what? For instance, in a product that is composed of other products in a typical complex supply chain environment. So it's a very complicated process. I think there's a lot of discussion going on still now, but in essence, to comply to the essential requirements that are stated in the Cyber Resilience Act, you will be able to refer in essence to standards. There's a lot of standards that have been mapped recently, but probably also not new for you. But the process that is happening now is about writing harmonized standard that companies and market operators will be able to refer to have presumption of conformity to CRA, saying, look, I apply this standard, and so you can trust me that I'm complying to this regulation. However, as I told you just at the beginning, there are some annexes in the text with some specific products. I'm not going to go into details, but the logic behind is that even though everyone has to apply to essential requirements, for some products, there will be a slightly different procedure to prove conformity. And the logic is some products are more critical. Some products are maybe wider spread all across the market. So for some product, for instance, you will need to undergo other procedures, namely have a third-party conformity assessment. So having like a specified body that will control that you actually comply to the regulation, or for instance, getting some European cybersecurity certification. So as you see, it's not a super simple process, but what I would say in essence, what the Cyber Resilience Act is a regulation of the EU, so it's effectively a law. It establishes minimum level of cybersecurity requirements. There are essential requirements. It's entered into force. It's not applied yet, but it's coming soon and it's coming fast. And then what we're discussing a lot in the community is how you prove that you're compliant to it. I hope I've been, again, not too boring, but I think I stayed in 10 minutes, and I think that was the time allocated to me.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Matteo. In fact, I've never had such an exciting presentation of the Cyber Resilience Act. So thanks a lot for that.
You need to say to me that offline too.
Sure. So this, I think, is quite clear if you are either making a product, either hardware or software, but somewhere perhaps where it can become a bit murkier would be when we're talking about the open source community, because they may make software, may make components that are used within hardware, but they may not be placing it directly on the market. So how would this impact them? And this can be quite a big consideration, because obviously if you have to comply with legislation, that suggests quite a bit of work, which maybe open source developers don't really have the capabilities or the knowledge to always be able to manage. So Gael is here to explain to us all how the open source community were impacted by the CRA. So I'll pass over to you, Gael.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation to this webinar. Well, yeah, first of all, please let me just frame what may be obvious, but when we talk about open source, it's software that complies with the open source definition as defined more than 25 years ago by the Open Source Initiative. And in fact, that's that software that implements the 4 freedoms defined by the Free Software Foundation even before that. So for an open source, for software to be open source, you have to be able to run the program for any purpose, to study how it works, to redistribute copies, and to distribute modified versions of the software, so to also modify it. And the fact is that over time, open source aid the world to the point that today you have every new software application is made of up to 90% of software open source software. So, like Matteo said earlier, the CRA is here. It's a regulation that applies to people who create digital products. And as such, the CRA is regulating the software industry, and that includes open source. But initially, that's created, some friction because for forever, the assumption of open source developers was that the software is provided as is. So if you look at this text, for example, that's the text of the MIT license, which is a very well used license. And more or less, the software is provided as is without warranty of any kind, and in no events should the author or copyright holders be liable for any claim. So that's more or less open source has been working for 30 years with the assumption that you get the software without warranties and without liability. And if you look at it, this is a diagram of where you can experience security threats when you build a software. And with open source, it becomes kind of a fractal diagram because applications rely on dependencies and on open source dependencies. And those open source dependencies rely on other open source dependencies. And that's really the challenge we have to address now, because when you build your own software and you have to prove that you have taken the right actions in terms of making sure your software has implemented cybersecurity best practices, then you also have to you rely on this long hierarchy and this high number of open source projects. So yeah, what we are in front as the open source community, we are in front of the need to improve the cybersecurity of the open source supply chain. And that's something that is not necessarily easy because open source developers are very busy people. Some of them are volunteers that do that on their spare time. Others are paid open source developers, but they are first not cybersecurity specialists, and they focus on implementing features rather than focusing on security issues. So we have kind of a mind shift to implement in the overall open source security, open source supply chain, open source community, sorry. And we are getting organized to address this challenge. We created this at the Eclipse Foundation. We created this Open Regulatory Compliance Working Group, and here we really address those different elements, which are that manufacturers have to do due diligence. So all the components sourced by third parties should not compromise the cybersecurity of the product, including open source components. And also, it's interesting because the CRA introduced something in the regulation, which is called open source stewards. And you can understand that open source stewards more or less are open source foundations. And they have a light regime, but they still need to document their cybersecurity policy, to implement proper vulnerability management, and also they can do security attestations. So what we have to do in this ORC working group is really to unify the open source software ecosystem best practices in terms of security, because we think that if we do it, we need to more or less standardize what we do so that we can do it at scale. Let's see a bit more what it means. So for the manufacturers, the the CRA requires manufacturers to check, to do due diligence across the supply chain. And for example, if as a manufacturer, you rely on an open source component, the fact is that this open source component will rely on many other open source components. So that's something that you may not be aware of. But it doesn't mean that you should not continue to use this open source software component. It means that we need some actions by the open source ecosystem to support the compliance of the CRA. And you may think that, so Matteo was talking about, okay, you have to do special actions to implement to have the CE marking on your software. So you need to implement compliance for your software. And some of you may already have to do compliance anyway in other contexts. But what's different here is that if you think about it, the full supply chain compliance, it means that you have to implement compliance on the code you author or the code you get from another proprietary software vendor. But you also have to make sure that all these open source dependencies are also compliant with the CRA requirements. And this is definitely where what we do at ORC is useful. Just a few words about this working group. It's a list of members we have now, so that's already a huge list for something that started formally in Q4 2024. You can see large organizations, but you can also see that most of the open source foundations are part of it. And we also have a number of European SMEs. And the focus is on education, because we see that a lot of people still don't really understand what it means for their software. And a lot of open source developers don't understand what they should do. So understanding even the terms of the CRA is very important for the ecosystem to be able to address the challenge. Then there is a technical development. So putting together the best practices that we will deploy to the different open source ecosystem. And also we know that in the next 18 months, there will be some precisions of the CRA. So there will be guidelines, and Matteo was also talking about standards that will bring a presumption of conformity if you implement those standards. So we are working to have a voice of the open source community in this process. So that's well, you can take this QR code to go to the website and learn more about what we do. But more or less, the idea is really that the more we apply best practices and the more we define best practices, we know that the open source ecosystem is very strong in adopted best practices. If you think about it, 15 years ago, CI/CD was not a thing for people, but the open source ecosystem started to do continuous integration, continuous deployment, because it was easier and it was more or less a good way to implement collaboration at scale. And so what we want to do with this initiative is to define what it means for an open source project to implement vulnerability management and to standardize that as much as possible, because all the open source foundations, for example, have processes to do vulnerability management. But when it's about smaller projects, they need guidelines. And also in terms of cybersecurity policy, we think that we can put together good templates that will, for example, make everybody's life easier so that they can, well, just build on top of something that has been proven. Thank you. I think I was also close to 10 minutes.
Yeah, we're being very punctual today, so thank you that. Thank you very much, Gael. So now we're going to look a bit more at some specific support mechanisms available to industry through a couple of EU projects that have been set up. So Matteo, you are part of Cyberstand. So if you'd like to just share some info about that.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, let me say, I suppose there will be there will be a lot of work done in the industry to create tools and to support. I mean, also as stated in the text, there is really an effort to create tools and guidelines to help the industry adapt and comply to the Cyber Resilience Act. I'm relatively new to this ecosystem as well, but part of these tools is also embodied by DEP projects, and as James said, I'm part of one of those, which is called Cyberstand. And I'm not going to be too formal on the project. Again, I'm not the best person to do that, but let me maybe start with the problem statement to get a bit the context of it. So at least the way I see it, but it refers a lot also to the open source community. As I said before, in order to be compliant with the Cyber Resilience Act, you need to apply some cybersecurity essential requirements. And typically, these requirements are something that are security controls and other best practices that are already used by the industry. Now, standards often offer this avenue of compliance because you can simply refer to the standards, apply what the standard says, and that's it. And then you can presume, it's called presumption of conformity, presume that you are being respecting what the Cyber Resilience Act is asking you to do. Now, even though there are existing standards and the European Union is taking into account the existing standards, we are into a process of writing what we call harmonized standards that will be applied across the EU. But the result is going to be the same. Once we will have these harmonized standards, it will be something for you to go refer to and be compliant to the Cyber Resilience Act. As for the open source community, when it comes to standardization, I was also learning this a few years ago. How does it work? How standards are born? When it comes to cybersecurity and harmonized standards, there are specific bodies in the EU specifically that gather together experts and draft standards. Now, in many cases, there are experts that do this on a voluntary basis, or as Gael was saying, some of these experts are already busy with other tasks. So it's a big effort going into these European organizations and support the drafting of standards. And as you know better than me, this is, I would like to call it a bit of a niche in a sense that we got ICT expert, we got cybersecurity experts, and then everyone could be a standardization expert, but it's not like a super simple thing. You need to be a standardization expert to write standards. As you can imagine, we don't have thousands or millions on the market out there. So it's not easy to have access to these people and to gather them to provide this work. This is the problem statement. So basically, in order to support this process, Cyberstand, the project I'm part of, in essence, is a tool to provide funding to these experts and their organization in order to just not do this for free, but just go into standardization organization and write standards. These are called specific service procedures, or SSP, and it's just an acronym to say that this is the funding available that is provided by Cyberstand. As I said, James, yeah, thank you. I see you already pasting some of the information in the chat. I'm not going to go into the governance of it, but in essence, Cyberstand is a very small consortium. We have digital SMEs, EXO, another organization that help us with the governments, but most importantly, we have the two main bodies that I was referring to that write the standards. So ETSI and CENELEC. Now, these organizations are, as I said, are organized with technical committees where we hope to help individuals be funded and go into this technical committee to work. So Cyberstand is not creating a new organization, it's not creating a new committee, it's simply supporting you as a standardization expert to go into these existing committees and help help the community writing the standards. What I'd like to say as well is that these are iterative calls. So Cyberstand is a 3 years project, but regularly we publish calls for funding. I think the current one is ending today, if I'm not wrong. So the deadline is today at 5. And there's a process behind it, right? Let me put it simple. I'm a standardization expert. I believe I can actually actively contribute. I can apply to this call for funding. And then there will be a process where I'll be reviewed by standardization expert. And if I'm accepted, then I will be entitled for this funding. If you will go on the website, you will see that there are specific mentioning about what is covered by the funding. So there are specific activities you can cover, such as going to conferences. I'm not sure about the details of this, but this is, once you get selected by the project, you're gonna have access to it, and also the type of topics that fall into the scope. So you can also have a look at those references in the website if you're unsure if you want to apply or not. For sure, there's a great need of standardization expert, as I said, and the clock is ticking. And that's why we have, let's say, transition period also, because we need the standards to be available before you can even be asked to be compliant to the Cyber Resilience Act. And for most of product with digital elements that Cyber Resilience Act is insisting on, you will be using the standards by means of a self-assessment. So this is a big chunk. Then, okay, there will be specific products, highly critical, where you will need someone professionally assessed that will come and say, okay, you can conform or not to the Cyber Resilience Act. Maybe, yeah, another note, Cyberstand is composed of, obviously, of these partner groups, but also there's a middle layer, a middleman. Let's say we call them Cyberstand communities. And these are, well, there's no money involved here, so you're not going to get paid if you join these communities. But we're trying to build a sort of recurring group of ICT expert or simply ICT professional that are the people that are not normally listened to or taken into account when it comes to writing, in the process of writing new regulation. Now, don't get me wrong, but open source community is the perfect example. Now we have dev projects, but for a long time, people wouldn't even realize that open source code in their software. And now suddenly we realize that, yeah, okay, we need to get this right. Maybe not as the same level of open source community, but we've been targeting in these Cyberstand communities, product developers, even sometimes ICT salespeople, lawyers, CEOs of startups. So it's really interesting for us to lower a bit the level of the, of the technicalities and letting this discussion around standard being with the same old people, but just getting new inputs from the ICT community at large. So I think more or less I covered it all. In essence, Cyberstand to us is a way to support US standardization expert to contribute to this work. And as I said, the clock is ticking. Things are going very fast. So there's a great need for the industry and to the industry to have this standard out. I hope it's been clear, but happy to take later on questions about this.
Sure. Thank you, Matteo. So just to reiterate, the current call closes today, but then there will be another one open very shortly. So you don't need to rush your application in before 5 o'clock. You can take a look at the webpage, understand the application, and then apply in the next round, which I think will be open in February. So just to keep an eye out for that. So now, Gael, if Cyberstand is focusing on the standards behind the CRA, there is also the compliance that we've discussed quite a lot. And Octet is looking to help open source developers in particular to manage their compliance. Is that correct?
Yes, thank you. That's correct. And as you say, there will be other open calls, so you can stay for my presentation. So yeah, just Octet in a few words. So that's a project that is funded by the ECCC, so the European Cyber Competency Center, and that will be a 2 years project in which we work on the topics of cybersecurity for open source with an angle of compliance automation. So in terms of partners, the Eclipse Foundation, we are the leader of the project, but we work with SMEs. Well, we work with Digital SME Alliance, of course, but also with other SMEs from Europe. So two of them are cybersecurity experts, and they will help us in understanding how companies can do self-assessment, etc. And three of them are tooling experts. So About Code, DoubleOpen, and BT. They will produce tools that will be available for SMEs to implement their compliance. So this is the project structure. So, well, forget about the project coordination and dissemination. That's kind of standard. But for the rest, we have two main work packages. One is to define and support compliance procedures. So here it's about self-assessment, having checklists, having guides to explain and to better understand what needs to be done. And the second one is to build open source tools to automate the discovery and to automate the building of SBOMs for projects. So if you look at our objectives, so the point is that it's a known fact that SMEs will kind of struggle with implementing cybersecurity because it's because of limited resources and because it's kind of expensive. So the goal of the project is really to empower SMEs to conform to the CRA with limited efforts, especially when it's about you know, what I presented earlier, which is this open source supply chain, the compliance on the open source supply chain. Because of course, for SMEs, using open source components is always a good price for value when you build your when you build your applications, and you need to make sure that it stays as it is a very interesting way of innovating and developing in a cost-effective way. So the first aspect is to empower SMEs, and the second aspect is to help strengthen the cybersecurity posture of both SMEs and open source actors. In terms of compliance, there is, of course, understanding the compliance requirements. So we are not alone to do that. I think that Matteo, what Matteo describes is also fully aligned with that. But what's interesting here is that Red Alert and Expertware are working on providing checklists to enable self-assessment. So that's tooling, but that's tooling like you know, a spreadsheet in which you have a guide to understand, okay, how can I prove that I've done this, I've done this, I've done this. And BT, DoubleOpen, and About Code, they are working on the managing the open source components. So that's really tooling to scan open source components and to create SBOMs. And that's also tooling to integrate that with the development process. So the idea is that you can run the tools to better understand to what extent you are exposed to vulnerabilities as you develop, and not just before you put your digital product on the market. So we think that, you know, okay, CRA is a big challenge for the open source community, but it's also an opportunity for the open source community to better address the security topics and to make sure that we have better software ultimately. So yeah. My last slide is this one, is that, well, we are actively recruiting SMEs, and for a few things. First, we need to better understand their requirements and the challenges they face, and to also get some real use cases, and also later to participate in the testing and the validation of the tools, and to provide feedback on the tools, whether it's a checklist and educational material, or if it's the tools, the open source tools, to be integrated in their continuous integration toolchain. So if you are interested, contact James or me or Sebastian, who is here too, and we will add you to a channel where we can start this conversation together. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Gael. And so now we can open the floor to any comments or questions. If you raise your hand, I can then unmute you, so we can proceed that way. So Dirk, I think you put your hand up first.
All right, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you very much for the presentation. That was quite a lot, many different aspects, but nicely put together. I don't understand a couple of things though, and could you please explain it to me? So the community or the discussion got upset about open source components being considered products. I have to say I never understood that. I think a component provided for free on GitHub is not a product. So the developer of that open source component who's not taking any money for it should not be subject to the CRA. That was my initial understanding, was my later understanding. If you disagree, it would be quite important for me to understand why such a random component on GitHub would be a product and falls under all these requirements. I do want to emphasize that I think the Eclipse initiative and the EU project are fabulous, but I don't think it puts requirements, or it's fair to say it puts requirements on the individual open source developer on GitHub, because the value of it is that industry comes together and makes compliance easier. There's a difference between the users of open source components and products needing to get compliance right, and any requirements on the original open source developer. So it's from the end user, so the final link in the supply chain, driving it into the supply chain, that let's collaboratively do compliance rather than everyone by themselves. On that, honestly, since I've been providing 20 years of training to large and small companies, large companies never needed my help because they've done open source compliance in their products forever. And it's only small companies. So I think the state of open source compliance in products is much better than when you said there is no compliance and everyone's ignoring that big part. So I know I said a lot. So let me summarize. Is open source, a free open source component, really a product? Is there any clear argument on that? And then please, I don't think you should say the open source developer is responsible for compliance to the CRA. It's a voluntary industry effort, which is fabulous to help folks help with compliance, but it's still not a requirement for the developer.
Yeah. So two things. We don't intend to, well, maybe if I said that the individual developers is responsible for security, that's not what I meant. I think that we as, whether it's open source foundations, whether it's GitHub itself, we will likely provide services. So we need to give the tools to developers so that it's easier and smoother for them to provide the data that would be required by their users to be compliant. The fact is that an individual developer who has an open source component on GitHub is not considered a manufacturer. That's where we are. That's our current understanding, and that's also something that will likely be clarified in the coming months when the European Commission issues guidelines or stuff like that. But at some point, when you start making money yeah, that's the point of placing on the market. But place on the market, it's, you know, there is a common sense, the common understanding of placing on the market that we as developer may have, which is that we make a release, we publish the release, and we make it, we start selling it for a price. The fact is that if you look at the European legislation, and a new legislative framework and the Blue Guide, if you do regular releases of your project, even if you publish it for free, at some point it may be considered that you put it on the market. So that's the kind of things we are still investigating and documenting in this FAQ.
Right. Thank you.
There was another question for you, Gael, from the chat. So it's asking about whether Octet is supporting agnostic security concepts in order to focus on cybersecurity standardization.
Yeah, I'm not a cybersecurity expert myself, so I will take the question and maybe come back to you later.
And another one is any impact that can be seen for IT service providers, even secondhand.
You mean if you are an IT service provider and you use, I think if you take open source components and put those open source components in a solution, and you put that solution on the market, then you likely become a manufacturer. So you will have to find a way to do your due diligence. So you have everybody has a common interest in the fact that we find a way to better address, to better create the SBOMs, etc. And just to follow up on what Dirk was saying, is that we had, I think that in the last 10, 15 years, you were mostly hired by small companies because they needed to figure out open source compliance in terms of license compatibilities. I think that this topic is more or less well addressed now, and that the next topic is this cybersecurity issue, and I'm confident we can do also good stuff to address it better.
Thank you, Gael. Matteo, maybe a couple of questions for you. So one is whether there's been an evaluation of the relationship between the CRA and the Product Liability Directive, where the product concept also covers software. And then related to this is also how will the compliance be managed of EU standards on the product list that are on the CRA law, but also other directives such as the NIS2 or DORA, and how is this overlap or potential kind of being covered by multiple pieces of legislation being approached?
Yeah, my RAM is very small, so I'll start with the last question, the one I remember best. I think there's a lot of efforts in mapping the interplay between regulations. I wouldn't say there is an official analysis. There are definitely many organizations that are making this effort. What I would suggest is that what we're doing it at EXO as well, the text itself has a lot of reminders of or pointers at other regulation and other directive or provision that it might repeal, or provision where Cyber Resilience Act is not applying because another regulation it is applying. So I'm confident this will be clarified in the future, but at the moment, indeed, this new regulation entering into force want to be a bit horizontal. That's the way we see it, and then we will clarify if there are any conflict. Well, there shouldn't be any conflict, but any overlap, so that you don't do the idea that you don't do work twice. So yeah, about the Product Liability Directive, but also other directive. So indeed, there are overlaps in those. Most standards have been developed at some point. Well, I don't have an official answer for that, but there will be standards that will be replaced. They will replace the standards of existing regulation, but in essence, you will need to comply to a single standard to cover both. But there's a lot of discussion going on to this. This is a very technical discussion, and I would say, let me comment on this, that sometimes we tend to create expert on each specific piece of law, but indeed the needs and the question is arising from most of you is to have an overarching view of what are all these pieces of law doing together. And building on this, because I saw a question in the chat, even though Cyber Resilience Act talks a lot about definition of products, the scope, and the annexes of some specific products, there's an important point, which is, I mean, not new in cybersecurity, which is that every also evaluation or assessment should be risks-based. So in Cyber Resilience Act, we're saying that you should be, or you should become familiar with on how to perform a risk assessment. And that's a basic, statement in cybersecurity. But it's going to be a piece of, like, let's say, flexibility in the law that where there will be more guidance published as the regulation says. There will be more explanation that will be delivered by other acts. But this is something also that needs to be taken into consideration. It's not simply reading a catalog and applying things. It's also understanding how your organization works, what are the risks, and based on that, apply the regulation. I don't know if I skipped one of the questions.
No, I think that was both of them. One about the product liability directive, and then is the interplay between the CRA and the other cybersecurity legislation. So I think that covered both. I don't see any more raised hands in the chat, or any further comments. So give a few more moments in case something comes to mind for anybody. But if not, in that case, I will say thank you very much, Matteo and Gael and Sebastian, for joining us today. I think it was really, really informative discussions and also some very useful. Here we go. Few questions. Okay.
Well, interesting question. I don't know Runcube as a project, but there is a. So the question is, where is Runcube hosted? Is there anybody making business on top of it? Because if they make business on top of it to some extent, they will have to make sure that there is a SBOM, there is a way of reporting vulnerabilities, there is a process, and to some extent, we need to be careful in how it will be implemented so that it doesn't break the social contract of open source. And I agree that it can be scary, but I think that the current version of the CRA is by far much better than what was planned initially. And that, you have this notion of stewards that can also be potentially, so there, at some point, there may be an interest to have a steward for Runcube. But ultimately, the idea is that people who use Runcube commercially, they will have the responsibility to make sure that it implements some cybersecurity best practices threshold. And well, how can we say it's a bad thing? That's
Thank you, Gael.
That I just, as Gael was saying, I think the initial version, different version of the proposal of the CRA were actually putting a lot of burden, maybe not willingly so, but they were putting burden on the open source community. And I'm not an historian, but we might consider that this was also due to some lack of awareness of how softwares are built. So the purpose of these dev projects and the cooperation among these projects is indeed to create awareness both on the communities that are working on the software, but also on the policy community, so that they meet and that find common ground. Because I don't think there is really any willingness to put burden or on how the software works today. There's willingness to increase the security postures, and then obviously in order to be effective, it needs to be possible. And so that's where your feedback comes into fruition.
Yeah, so like we said, documenting your use case and making sure that this specific use case, I put the link of the FAQ, etc. So that's something that the conversation is fully happening on GitHub in the open. So everybody can contribute to pull request, a new issue, etc. And well, maybe Victor, what you want to do is to push your question, and we can document it and see, and also push it to the standardization bodies and to the European Commission to get their feedback and to also make sure they understand the problem. I think that one thing that is very important is that over the last 2 years, we have so the CRA came as something unexpected for the open source community, but it was also a wake-up call that, well, we need to make sure that those regulations don't happen in a way that the people doing the regulation don't know about the open source ecosystem and don't know about the requirements and the kind of magic that happens in this open source ecosystem. And I think that we are not there yet, but we have made huge progress since the end of 2022. And there are definitely communications channels established that guarantee that we can be heard. So let's take this Roundcube example as an interesting example.
And I'm sorry, just another note, that's exactly the same for standards, right? I think there has been a time where people were making comments that was perceived like as sort of judgment, or put the regulator maybe under pressure. But the idea now is really to gather useful feedback, and there's an open door to listen to that and to enrich, for instance, the drafting of the standard in this case. But I really think there is probably a dynamic where a regulator understand that they need to talk to the people who are sitting in the field and know better about these things to enrich the regulation. And the CRA evolution has proved that.
Okay, thank you for that, both of you. I think the chat, seems to be all okay. I don't think there are any more questions. So thank you once again for joining us. Thank you, Matteo. Thank you, Gael. Very, very informative discussion. And just a reminder once again to check the links in the chat for information on Cyberstand and Octet. And I'm sure we'll be back again soon with more information. So wish you all a good Monday and a nice week. And I'll say goodbye.
Thanks, bye-bye.
Thank you, bye-bye.